Crowns, castles, centuries of power. You'd think people who ruled the world would go out with some dignity. A dramatic final breath. A whispered Latin phrase. Maybe a string quartet fading softly in the background. Instead, some of history's most powerful monarchs died in ways so absurd, so humiliating, so deeply undignified. Their own courts tried to erase the evidence. How does a king eat himself to death? What monarch was killed by a man who was already dead? And which ruler was literally too flammable to survive his own medical treatment? If you want to hear the stories history tried to hide, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because these aren't the deaths they taught you in school. Let's begin. February 1771. Sweden is locked in the bitter grip of winter, and inside the royal palace, King Adolf Frederick is staring down a problem that has plagued monarchs since the beginning of time: boredom, stress, the crushing weight of absolutely nothing important to do. So he does what any reasonable person would do when the days grow dark and the nights grow long. He treats himself. But Adolf Frederick doesn't just treat himself. He declares war on moderation. The royal kitchen that evening receives an order that would make a Roman emperor blush. Course after course emerges from the kitchens. Lobster still cracking from the boil. Caviar gleaming like black pearls. Sauerkraut, because even kings need roughage. Smoked herring, because why not? And champagne, not one glass. Several. Enough to make the royal wig feel genuinely dizzy. The king eats like a man who has just discovered that calories don't count if you wear a crown. Course after course disappears. The servants exchange glances. The courtiers pretend not to notice. But none of this kills him. None of it. What does him in arrives on a single plate, innocent and unassuming, like a dessert assassin in sweet disguise. 14 servings of semla. Now, unless you're Scandinavian, you've probably never tasted one. Semla is a wheat roll, spiced with cardamom, stuffed with almond paste, topped with a mountain of whipped cream, and served floating in a bowl of warm milk. It is delicious. It is decadent. It is the kind of dessert you eat exactly one of before loosening your belt and questioning every decision that led you to this moment. Adolf Frederick, 814. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 14. That's not dessert. That's a sugar-based suicide mission. Somewhere between roll number 10 and roll number 13, a servant must have approached. A brave soul, perhaps the royal physician, someone willing to risk the king's wrath for the sake of the king's intestines. "Your Majesty," they whispered, "perhaps a digestive walk around the courtyard." The king waved them off, spoon in one hand, cream on his lips, the flush of sugar rushing through his veins. He was a man possessed by pastry. He was going to finish what he started, and he did. Later that evening, the first cramps arrived. Just a twinge at first, easily ignored. But then the pain deepened, spread, became something more urgent. Servants rushed, physicians gathered. The king, who hours earlier had been laughing with cream on his chin, now lay pale and sweating, clutching his stomach as if his own body had turned against him. And in a way, it had. The official cause of death, recorded in court documents with as much dignity as the physicians could muster, was simply this: digestive problems, which is the historical equivalent of writing food coma on a death certificate. But we know the truth. The King of Sweden, a man who had ruled nations, commanded armies, and sat on a throne polished by generations, was killed by 14 sweet rolls. He wasn't assassinated by rivals. He wasn't struck down in battle. He didn't die of plague or poison or the curse of a rival noble. He was taken out by a pastry, and in a strange way, there's something almost majestic about it. Not tragic, not heroic, just deeply, irrevocably human. Because who among us hasn't looked at that extra slice of cake and heard a little voice whisper, "Go on, you deserve it." Adolf Frederick just listened a little too closely, and as his body gave out and the palace fell into chaos, one question lingered in the cold Swedish air. What do you write on the tombstone of a man who ate himself to death? The answer, it turns out, is nothing. History wrote it for him. And now, As we leave the king to his eternal digestive rest, we turn to another monarch, whose final moment was equally undignified, but for completely different reasons. Because if Adolf Frederick died on a throne of cream and cardamom, the next king met his end on a very different kind of throne altogether. But if you think a king dying from 14 desserts is undignified, wait until you hear about King George II of Great Britain. Because this monarch's final moment didn't happen in a banquet hall or a bedchamber. It happened in a room so private, so undignified, that his own courtiers spent centuries trying to live it down. October 25th, 1760. The king wakes up feeling off. Just a bit strange. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that suggests this is the day history will remember him for all the wrong reasons. He goes through his morning routine because that's what kings do. They follow protocol. They maintain appearances. They pretend everything is normal, even when their body is quietly plotting against them. Light conversation with his attendants. Some royal grumbling about the weather or politics or whatever irritated monarchs grumble about in the 18th century. And then, as all men must, he excuses himself for a moment of private business, a visit to the privy. The chamber pot. The toilet, if we're being honest about what we're discussing here. He goes in alone. The door closes. The attendants wait outside, probably discussing palace gossip or counting the hours until their shift ends. Minutes pass. Nothing unusual. Kings take time. Kings are entitled to their privacy. But then more minutes pass, and then enough minutes pass that someone finally knocks. No answer. They knock again. Louder this time. Still nothing. And when they finally push open the door, they find the King of England, defender of the faith, ruler of an empire spanning continents, slumped over the chamber pot, dead. An aortic aneurysm, the physicians would later explain. A rupture of the body's largest artery. Instant. Massive. Unforgiving. He was gone before he hit the floor. But let's just sit with that image for a second. The king, mid-morning, mid-business, midlife at 76 years old, simply stopped existing in the most vulnerable position a human being can occupy. No deathbed farewell, no weeping nobles, no final words of wisdom whispered to grieving heirs. Just a man, some porcelain, and eternity. To be fair, it wasn't a peasant's chamber pot. Let's give him that much. We're talking royal porcelain. Possibly gold-rimmed. Definitely flanked by servants trained in the art of pretending they hadn't just witnessed the most embarrassing royal death in British history. But still, the location. The timing. The sheer indignity of it all. The physicians wrote it up respectfully, because that's what physicians do when monarchs die in compromising positions. Heart problems, they told the public. Sudden and unexpected. Technically true. But court gossip? Court gossip has no loyalty. Court gossip has a long memory and an even longer tongue. And within days, everyone knew. The king died on the toilet. The king died mid-business. The king, who had ruled for 33 years, who had fought wars and signed treaties and sat on a throne polished by centuries, met his end with his pants at half-mast. And here's the thing about embarrassing royal deaths. They stick. They outlive every accomplishment. George II's reign had its moments. Wars. Reforms. An empire to manage. But ask anyone today what they remember about him, and they won't mention any of that. They'll mention the toilet. Because history has a dark sense of humor, and it never forgets the punchline. He ruled an empire and died like a man. No ceremony. No drama. Just a quiet, private, deeply human exit that his successors have spent centuries trying to live down. But as embarrassing as George II's exit was, at least he died alone. The next king on our list? He didn't even get that mercy. Now we shift tones. Because some royal deaths make you chuckle, and some make you sit in uncomfortable silence. And this one? This one lands somewhere in the grey space between tragedy and horror. Meet Crown Prince Sado of Korea, heir to the Joseon dynasty. 18th century. A young man born into privilege, groomed for power, destined to rule millions, and ultimately remembered as the prince who died inside a box. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Inside an actual wooden box, large enough to hold rice, small enough to hold a man who couldn't get out. Sado had issues. That's the polite way history puts it when the truth is too uncomfortable to stare at directly. Mental illness, probably. Violent outbursts, definitely. Erratic behavior that terrified everyone around him. He executed servants on whims. Wandered the palace at night with a sword, muttering to himself. The court lived in fear. His own family lived in fear. And his father, King Yongzhou, lived in the worst kind of fear of all. The fear of what his own son might become. Now imagine being that father, a Confucian monarch, a man obsessed with order, with ritual, with appearances. Your son, your heir, the future of your dynasty is unraveling in public. You can't hide it, you can't fix it, and you can't ignore the whispers. Something must be done. But executing your own son? Politically messy, spiritually scandalous, a stain on the throne that would never wash clean. Leaving him alive, though? Even riskier. So the king got creative. The kind of creative that keeps historians awake at night. He summoned his son to the palace, calmly, without warning, without suspicion. And then he had Sado placed inside a large wooden rice chest, the kind normally used to store grain for the winter, large enough to crouch, not large enough to stand, not large enough to lie down, just enough space to exist in agony. It was mid-July in Korea, which means heat, humidity, air so thick you can taste it. Inside that chest, no ventilation, no water, no food, no hope of a quick end. Just darkness, suffocation, and the slow realization that your own father just sealed your fate with wood and silence. Sado survived for 8 days. 8 days. Imagine the sounds that chest contained. The screams no one answered. The pounding that grew weaker with each passing hour. The desperate prayers whispered to gods who seemed to be listening somewhere else. 8 days of a man slowly realizing that dynasties are more important than sons. That thrones matter more than blood. That sometimes the people who brought you into this world are the same ones who will trap you inside it. No trial. No blade. No dignified execution with witnesses and formal charges. Just wood. Just silence. Just a slow, sealed descent into history as one of the most uncomfortable royal deaths ever recorded. The official records, cleaned up for posterity, state that Prince Sado passed away due to divine judgment, which is a beautiful way of saying something unspeakable, which is history's way of scrubbing blood from the floor. But let's be honest, he was rice-boxed to death, and the most tragic part? His son would go on to become one of Korea's most celebrated rulers, a king so beloved, so accomplished, so respected that his father's sin became a footnote. The family never publicly spoke of the box, but historians never forgot, and neither will you. Next time you complain about tight spaces or summer heat, remember Crown Prince Sado. Remember that dynasties are built on bones, and sometimes the most undignified deaths are also the most silent. But if you think being suffocated by your own father is the darkest this list gets, wait until you hear about the king who died because he couldn't stop laughing. From tragedy to absurdity, from silence to sound. Because if you think being sealed in a box by your own father is the darkest way for a royal to exit this world, wait until you meet the king who died because he couldn't stop laughing. If you've ever been told that laughter is the best medicine, allow me to introduce you to the one man in history who proved that too much of it will kill you just as dead as any plague. King Martin of Aragon. The year is 1410. Martin is nearing the end of his reign, though he doesn't know it yet. What he does know is that his body has betrayed him in the most undignified way possible. He's been battling digestive issues for weeks. The kind of royal gastrointestinal drama that clears out courtiers and makes servants hold their breath when they enter the room. He spent the day in bed, not from heroic wounds received in battle, not from a wasting illness contracted in service to his kingdom, but from chronic flatulence and indigestion so severe that moving seemed like a personal insult to his own intestines. The king is miserable. The king is bloated. The king is frankly tired of being alive at this particular moment. So he does what any monarch with unlimited resources and a desperate need for distraction does. He demands entertainment. Specifically, he demands his personal jester. The court jester, that licensed fool whose entire purpose is to make powerful people forget their troubles, even if only for a moment. The jester arrives. The king, propped up on pillows, probably clutching his stomach, looks at him with the desperate hope of a man who just needs one good laugh, one moment of relief. One reason to remember why being alive is still worth the effort. He asks for a joke. Something light, something funny. Anything to lift his bloated spirits. And the jester delivers. The joke, preserved in court accounts because history has a bizarre sense of what deserves to be remembered, goes something like this. The king asks why the jester took so long to arrive. And the jester replies, "Because I saw a young deer hanging from a fig tree by its tail, and I had to stop and wonder if it was an act of divine punishment." Now, you have to understand something. This joke is not funny. By any modern standard, it barely qualifies as a joke. A deer hanging from a tree by its tail? Divine punishment for what? Eating too many figs? It's the kind of nonsense that would get a jester booed off a stage today. But maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the delivery. Maybe it was the fact that Martin hadn't laughed in weeks because he'd been too busy digesting an entire goose and regretting every life choice that led him to this bed. Maybe the absurdity of it, the sheer meaningless stupidity of a deer hanging from a fig tree, broke something loose in his brain. Whatever the reason, Martin burst into hysterical laughter. And here's the thing about hysterical laughter. It doesn't stop. It builds. It feeds on itself. The more he laughed, the funnier everything seemed. The funnier everything seemed, the more he laughed. His stomach, already compromised by weeks of digestive chaos, began to seize. His breathing became erratic. Tears streamed down his face. His courtiers probably started laughing too, at first, because laughing kings are happy kings and happy kings don't execute people. But then the laughter went on too long, and then it changed, became something else, something alarming. The king was gasping now, clutching his stomach, not with indigestion, but with genuine distress. His face, moments ago red with mirth, began to pale, his body convulsed, and then, in front of his horrified court, King Martin of Aragon collapsed, dead. Official cause of death, recorded by physicians who probably struggled to write it with straight faces, was indigestion and uncontrollable laughter. King Martin literally laughed himself to death, over a joke about a deer and a fig tree. There's something both tragic and deeply undignified about it. Monarchs are supposed to die heroically, on battlefields, in marble halls. During dramatic monologues with their heirs gathered around the bed, Martin met his end with a punchline ringing in his ears and a smile frozen on his face. His advisors must have struggled to write that report. Your Majesty has passed while laughing extremely hard. Please advise on how to phrase this for the history books. The succession crisis that followed plunged Aragon into political chaos. But no one could discuss it without stifling a grim chuckle. Because how do you mourn a king who died from a joke? How do you take seriously the death of a man whose final moment was defined by absurdity? In the end, Martin's death became legend. Proof that yes, humor can kill. That the best medicine can also be the last medicine. So laugh wisely, especially after dinner. But if you think dying from a joke is undignified, wait until you hear about the Pope who died in bed with someone else's wife. The papacy. The holiest office in Christendom. The direct line to God, or so they claim. You'd expect the men who occupy that throne to depart this world with dignity, surrounded by cardinals, clutching crucifixes, whispering final prayers as angels hover somewhere near the ceiling. And most of them do. Most of them. But then there's Pope John XII, born Octavianus, because apparently his parents looked at their baby and thought, yes, this child will definitely grow up to lead millions of souls toward salvation. He became Pope in 955 AD at just 18 years old, a teenager, with unlimited power, in charge of the spiritual welfare of everyone who mattered in medieval Europe. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Absolutely everything. Becoming the spiritual leader of millions before you're old enough to rent a chariot turns out to be a terrible idea. Who knew? The result was a papacy so chaotic, so scandalous, so deeply inappropriate that later popes probably burned incense just to cleanse the memory of him from the Vatican walls. John XII didn't just bend the rules. He took them, wadded them up, and threw them out the window of his palace, which reportedly resembled less a seat of Christendom and more a Roman frat house after a 3-day bender. He gambled, constantly. He drank, excessively. He allegedly ordained a 10-year-old as bishop, because why wait until someone understands theology to put them in charge of it? He blessed a man's mistress, which is the ecclesiastical equivalent of endorsing everything you're supposed to oppose. He even raised toasts to the devil during Mass, which takes a special kind of audacity when you're literally standing at an altar. The papal palace became a destination for parties, for women, for every indulgence a young man with a crown and no supervision could imagine. Monks wrote about it in horrified whispers. Historians recorded it with raised eyebrows. The people of Rome knew. The clergy knew. Everyone knew. And still, he was pope, until his death, which, given his lifestyle, was about as undignified as his life. According to multiple chroniclers, multiple sources who had no reason to coordinate their stories, Pope John XII died of a stroke. But not during prayer, not at the altar, not even during one of his famously inappropriate banquets. He reportedly suffered that fatal stroke while in bed with a married woman. Let that sink in for a moment. The Vicar of Christ, the successor to Peter, the man who claimed to hold the keys to heaven, died mid-affair with someone else's wife. The scandal wasn't just that he was having sex. Clergy have always struggled with that particular vow. The scandal was the location, the timing, the complete and total abandonment of even the pretense of holiness. He wasn't even trying to hide anymore. Now, to be fair, the Vatican never released an official statement confirming this account, possibly because official statements back then were written by monks who preferred not to die of embarrassment. Possibly because admitting your pope died in someone else's bed is bad PR, even by medieval standards. But the rumor took on a life of its own. It spread through courts and monasteries and taverns. It became the thing everyone whispered about when they thought no one was listening. Even centuries later, historians couldn't quite agree whether it was truth or a very juicy smear campaign. But let's say for a moment it was true. Imagine being the priest assigned to write the eulogy. Imagine standing at the altar, looking out at the cardinals, the nobles, the faithful gathered to mourn, and having to find something nice to say. Here lies Pope John XII, shepherd of the faithful, Vicar of Christ, and frequent visitor of marital bedrooms. His death marked the end of one of the most infamously unpapal papacies in history. He reigned for just under a decade, and in that short time he managed to blur nearly every line between sacred and profane. He proved that a crown doesn't create character. That power without wisdom is just chaos with better robes. Pope John XII joins our list, not just for how he died, but for how spectacularly he ignored the job description. He came, he sinned, he stroked out, and history never forgot.